Okay, so we're at the bank of the Grand River here by the West Montrose covered bridge. We're going to talk here a little bit about the history of the bridge, the history of the Mennonite settlers and population in this part of southwest Ontario, and we're also going to go over some of the details of the Haudenosaunee history that we talked about last week before reading week in class. The bank of the Grand River is, of course, land that was promised to the Haudenosaunee Six Nations, 6 miles either side of the Grand River, and we'll talk a bit more about the history associated with that, with the Haldeman Proclamation that agreed to this land tenure along the side of the Grand River. But first I want to talk a little bit about the bridge that we see here. This bridge was built in 1881 by John Bear. It's the second oldest surviving bridge in Waterloo region and the only covered bridge left in Ontario. There are still, I think, hundreds in Quebec and New Brunswick. Ontario used to have 5 and now this is the last one. It would have been built originally entirely out of wood, and it's undergone excessive renovations almost every other decade. And you could kind of see as we walked through, of course, the bridge is no longer only wood. There are lots of other kinds of supports that have gone in place to maintain and preserve the bridge. It's still open to automobile traffic, so obviously this wasn't really something that people predicted in 1881, so there have been needs to preserve the bridge, not just for transport but also for tourism practices. So just some details about the replacements. Timber abutments replaced with concrete after 1900. Wooden trusses replaced in 1933. In 1955 the original oak floor was asphalted over wood planking. In 1959 the trusses were replaced again. And metal spans concealed behind wooden panels maintain the original appearance. So this is a bridge that has been replaced and reinforced with metal and has wooden paneling placed over that metal to kind of maintain this late 19th century aesthetic for, again, I think tourism reasons. The bridge since 1999 has been owned by the region of Waterloo. So why cover a bridge, right? Most bridges that we see are not in fact covered bridges, but covering a bridge in this way and at the time that it was built would have extended the lifespan of the bridge from around 10 to 15 years to around 70 to 80 years, protecting it from various kinds of adverse weather. What else do I want to talk about here? So let's talk a little bit about the Mennonite and Haudenosaunee history in this area. So this is some of the details that were covered in the lecture last week. Archaeologists and historians, as well as the oral record, note that indigenous culture would have moved into this area in around the last 11,000 years. So 11 to 12,000 years ago, there would have been indigenous people living on, using, accessing this land for a variety of purposes. There's large-scale archaeological evidence from at least the 16th century, and the oral record also goes back to around that time too, from my understanding. The Anishinaabe would have lived on this land alongside the Grand River in the 1600s, and though, as far as I know, at least from the Susan Hill text that I mentioned in the lecture last week, other nations have used this land. This would have been Haudenosaunee territory, but didn't directly live on this land, apart from the Anishinaabe, until after the American Revolution. So around 1670, European colonial exploits were dependent upon North American indigenous knowledge and trading. further processes of colonialism, dispossession, and other forms of violence, as we talked about in fairly great detail last week, undermined any sense of symbiotic relationship. For the Haudenosaunee and other nations in this area, this was a relationship of equality, mutual understanding, and separation. This was not the same for the European settlers, who often paid lip service to traditional agreements like the Turo Wampum, but also continually undermined them and subsequently apologized, said that they would repair the relationship once again, only to break that promise another time. The Haudenosaunee are also referred to as the Six Nations. This is a confederacy of 6 nations, including the Mohawk, Onondaga, Oneida, Cayuga, Seneca, and Tuscarora. During the American Revolution in 1776, most of the 6 nations remained loyal to the British, and the granting of land was framed as a reward for their loyalty to the British Crown during the American Revolution. This framing, of course, of gifting land back to people who had historically been using and accessing that land is clear evidence of a colonial process. How can you gift land back to a nation who essentially already owned it, at least in a colonialist sense, right? So this is a practice of dispossession, and essentially what happened during the American Revolution is that large amounts of Haudenosaunee land was essentially annexed by the new American nation, and there was very little place for the Haudenosaunee in their traditional territories in what's now the US of upstate New York and Ohio.